Hello, and welcome back to Bella's Haven for Healing. I am so happy that you are here. In this three-part video series, we will gain deeper insight to developmental trauma, how it shows up in the body, and how trauma symptoms may look like medical conditions. When we hear the word trauma, we usually think of a single, massive, life-altering event. But today, we're talking about something a bit more subtle, yet incredibly profound: developmental trauma. Think of this as what happens when a child's foundational core needs are not met during the very years they are figuring out who they are and whether the world is a safe place. It's usually not a sudden shock wave. It's more like a slow, ongoing drip. The chronic absence of safety, consistency, or emotional validation. It's what happens when a child grows up wondering, does anyone actually have my back? To really grasp this, we have to look at how it differs from traditional shock trauma. Shock trauma is a painful memory of an event, something that happened to you. Developmental trauma, on the other hand, actually gets woven directly into your brain's operating system. It shapes your fundamental lens, how you view yourself, how you judge other people's intentions, and whether you move through life feeling inherently safe or constantly on guard. Now, let's look a little bit at the brain science behind this, because it's actually incredibly hopeful, but also shows how and why early timing matters so much. Our brains are plastic, meaning they're highly changeable and adaptable from birth all the way up into our mid-20s. But here is the golden rule of thumb. The earlier the trauma happens, the deeper the foundation it builds. If a child experiences trauma at age 3, it's literally rewiring the base layer of their architecture. If it happens at age 14, it's building on top of whatever foundation was already established. Let's break down these developmental windows, starting with ages 0 to 7. This is the ultimate critical window. This is when the brain's baseline operating system is being installed. Your attachment style, your core beliefs about your own worth, and your basic safety radar are hardwired right here. That's why a kid who feels completely safe during these first 7 years has a totally different internal baseline to fall back on later in life, compared to a child who didn't get that secure start. Moving into ages 7 to 12, the brain is busy solidifying and expanding on those early patterns. If the early years were unstable, trauma during this preteen window compounds those issues. If the early years were stable, trauma here can start carving out entirely new negative patterns. Because kids at this age are developing more complex, sophisticated ways of thinking, the way they process and internalize trauma becomes much more cognitively complex as well. Next up is adolescence, ages 12 to 18. And neuroscientists are increasingly realizing just how criminally underestimated this window is for trauma impact. What's happening inside a teenager's head is a massive construction project. The limbic system, which controls emotions and threat detection, is absolutely exploding. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and impulse control, is still very much under construction. Because of this gap, the teenage brain is incredibly vulnerable. Trauma during these years fundamentally shapes identity formation, how they navigate relationships, and their core self-concept. And finally, we look at ages 18 to 25. A lot of folks think that once you turn 18, you're fully baked. But the brain is actually still developing, particularly in areas of executive function. Because of this ongoing growth, experiencing trauma in early adulthood can still profoundly disrupt a brain that is trying to cross the finish line of its primary development. So, what does this actually look like in real life? Well, it can stem from many different environments. We might be talking about an emotionally unavailable or neglectful caregiver, chronic criticism and shaming, or parentification, where a child is forced to emotionally or physically parent their own parent. It includes things like witnessing domestic violence, severe sibling bullying, or fighting for attention, frequent moves that disrupt any sense of stability, or living with a parent dealing with untreated mental illness or addiction. Over time, these environments heavily manifest as deep attachment wounds, chronic people pleasing, or a fierce hyperindependence where you feel like you cannot rely on anyone but yourself. When we think about trauma, our minds usually go to the bad things that did happen: the shouting, the chaos, the overt pain. But neglect based developmental trauma is about the profound impact of what did not happen. It's the invisible trauma of the empty space. It's a child crying out and eventually going quiet because they realize no one is coming. It's growing up with a lack of emotional warmth, a lack of tracking, and a lack of attunement. In a neglect based environment, you learn very early to minimize your own needs. You tell yourself you don't matter and essentially become invisible just to cope. It teaches you that you are entirely on your own. Now, on the flip side of neglect, we have enmeshment based developmental trauma. If neglect is the trauma of too much distance, enmeshment is the trauma of no boundaries at all. This happens when a parent relies on their child to meet their own emotional needs, treats them like a therapist, or uses them as an emotional crutch. In mesh dynamic, the child is not allowed to have their own separate identity, secrets, or independent feelings. If the parent is sad, the child has to be sad. If the parent is angry, the child has to fix it. It forces you to sacrifice your own individuality just to keep the relationship stable. As adults, this usually shows up as a massive struggle to set boundaries, intense guilt whenever you try to take care of yourself, and a chronic habit of taking on other people's emotional baggage as if it's your own. To wrap things up, let's look at how these past experiences show up in adult life. Because these are deeply embedded, patterned responses, they don't always look like explosive outbursts. Instead, they show up as chronic anxiety, an intense fear of abandonment, or finding it incredibly difficult to trust even genuinely good people. You might see a constant struggle to say no or set boundaries, a lingering sense of low or no self worth, or an obsessive need for perfectionism and overachievement just to feel like you've earned love. Ultimately, it keeps the nervous system stuck on high alert, leaving a person feeling a deep, quiet sense that something is inherently wrong with them. These patterns show up everywhere: in romantic relationships, in families, at our jobs, and most importantly, in how a person relates to themselves. If parts of this felt familiar, I hope you leave with one reminder today: that nothing you survived was your fault, and nothing your nervous system learned to do for survival means that you are broken. It simply means that your brain adapted, and adaptation can now become healing. I'll see you over in part 2, and remember, always be kind.